everyone doing?
Great.
Are you enjoying having some rain?
Yes.
Is that an English question? You didn't have any in Santa Monica? Really?
Not yet.
Well, hopefully at some point. Well, it's good to see you all. Thank you for turning up for a caffeinated verse and to, come listen to Kareem Tayyar, who's our featured reader today, and also to share some poems with each other and listen to each other and deepen our connections to each other. So it's really special to be here today with you all. Just want to go straight into introducing Kareem. I've never met you before today, so we've only spoke through email, but one thing I really enjoyed about Kareem's work, I found some online on the Poetry Foundation and then through his books. He has a couple of there. Keats in San Francisco, and let's see if I get this right. Let Us Praise Ordinary Things. If that's correct? Okay, I'll do it from memory. And I found Kareem has an excellent way of retaining dreamlike and poetic sensibility, but also being accessible and straight talking, which I find really refreshing, and thought it would be, great to have him read here. As for his bio, which I'm going to read from, Kareem Tayyar holds a PhD in literature from the University of California, Riverside, and he is a professor of English at Golden West College in Southern California. His books include, as I said, Keats in San Francisco and Other Poems, published by Lily Poetry Review Books, Let Us Now Praise Ordinary Things, Arroyo Seco Press. If I pronounce any of that wrong, please feel free to correct me. And The Prince of Orange County, Pelicanesis, the latter of which received the 2020 Eric Hoffer Award for Young Adult Fiction. His works appeared in numerous literary journals, including Poetry Magazine, Prairie Schooner, North Dakota Quarterly, and the Santa Monica Review. And he's been the recipient of a Glenna Luce Poetry Prize and a Wurlitzer Poetry Fellowship. So I'd like to also to warmly welcome Kareem as we sit and listen to his poems.
It's really nice to be here with you all. I really appreciate you guys having me, and thank you for the really kind introduction. I thought I would start with a poem that was inspired by my father. Was born and raised in Iran, and came to this country in the 1970s. And I remember gradually, as time went on, a lot of other people that he had kind of grown up with eventually wound up finding their way here as well. And this poem's inspired by a story that I remember one of his friends telling us about what the final straw was for him deciding to kind of finally immigrate to this country. So it's called A Winter's Night in Tehran, 1979. On the night they burned the movie theater, you thought of the time you and Hamid had gone there to see a late showing of Bonnie and Clyde. When at the film's conclusion, the audience had stood up and applauded for several minutes before leaving the building. Afterwards, the two of you had gone to a cafe and talked about Faye Dunaway's beauty, Warren Beatty's charisma, and how the two of them were the American counterculture's answer to Layla and Majnun, yet another pair of lovers who wrongly believed that they controlled their own destiny. With your windows open and the scent of smoke entering your room, and your decision to leave for America having been made, you realized you suddenly understood what Clyde Barrow had meant when he said that he and Bonnie weren't running towards something, but away from something else. This poem's actually inspired by, I love spending time at Olvera Street in Los Angeles, especially, I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Blessing of the Animals, which is the day before Easter Sunday every year, going back well over 100 years. They have a big kind of ceremony out there where people from all over the area bring their animals to be blessed. So you'll see kids will bring their stuffed animals. Farmers will come down from the hills with their cows and their sheep. People will come with their cats and their dogs. It's a lot of fun. And they always have great mariachi bands playing in the little gazebo just off the main courtyard. So this is called Mariachi Singer, Old Vera Street, Los Angeles. As she sings, the sky goes from blue to black and back again. The children grow old and then young. The lovers fall in and out and back into love. And the bouquets of flowers I hold in my hands blooms and then wilts and blooms again. Their petals like the small hands of a gentle goddess who knows that a love song is a prayer, a sad song is a poem, and a dance song on a summer afternoon is about as good as life is likely to get. This one was inspired by, several years ago, missing the last BART car out of Oakland and just kind of having to find things to do for the night. So this is called Oakland 2:35 a.m. Those Orpheus blues the musician strums, those 12-bar crossroads blues, blues for the subway girl who got away, blues for the young man in the mirror whose face you have not seen in years, blues for those pre-war nights, for those rolling fields fired by the lights of all those dreaming railroad men, their hearts tied to the tracks, night rolling over them and them still beating, those welfare blues, those I'll never drink again blues, those last call and she isn't going home with you blues, those rooftop blues where you're standing close enough to the ceiling of the world to paint it, to turn that bald blue canvas into fresco, those early Adam blues, those no looking back blues, a man and a woman, one suitcase between them, leaving the garden forever blues. And somehow everyone in this club is dancing. More than a few people's feet have left the floor. And it's the levitation blues. It's the God give me pain and I'll raise you grace blues. And anyway, it's still raining outside. And some drunk girl near the bar says something about the moon falling from the sky. And it's too late for us to catch our train. And you've never looked as lovely as you do right now. Your soul like a G chord that just rings and rings and rings. An electric church bell calling me to worship blues. So this was inspired by my father's mother came out from Iran for one summer when I was about 8 years old. It was the only time I had the chance to meet her. And that summer has still kind of stayed with me for the rest of my life for a lot of reasons. And so this poem was kind of inspired by that particular summer. It's called The Summer of Last Suppers. When I would come home from school, she would look at me and ask in Farsi, a language I had never learned to speak, what I wanted for lunch. For an answer, I would just smile and nod my head. Yes, I would say. Yes. And then I would go and sit on the sofa and watch television while she cooked. 15 minutes, sometimes a half an hour later, she would emerge from the kitchen with a plate. If she had made me a hamburger, it was the largest hamburger the world had ever seen. The meat patty the size of the plate itself, and sliced into two halves, each of them needing 2 slices of bread to cover the meat. On the days when she made fish, it was a salmon the size of a dolphin, its eyes wide open, as if it too couldn't believe that she thought I could eat the entire thing. French fries, they'd be as thick as your thumbs, and there'd be 80 or 100 of them, piled so high that they looked like their own unhealthy food pyramid. For snacks, she'd bring an entire watermelon to the table, slice it open, and hand me a fork. The same with a cantaloupe. At the time, I thought she was worried that I was too skinny, or that the head nod in Iranian culture meant give me the largest of everything. But now I realize she wasn't feeding me for the day, but for the rest of my life. That those 2 months of meals were going to have to last me forever. And that she wanted the taste of those burgers and those magical outsized watermelons and cantaloupes to stay with me long after she had gone back to Shiraz, long after her temporary travel visa had expired, long after she had become too old to board a plane and fly halfway across the world to see us. Because a full belly, after all, means love in any language. This one was written, I'm guessing a lot of you probably had a pretty similar experience during the early months of the pandemic. I was starting to climb the walls a little bit. And one of the things that I started doing late at nights was watching a lot of travel shows on TV, like especially a lot of the Anthony Bourdain travel shows. And so this poem kind of came out of being inspired by a lot of those travel programs. This is called Advice for a Traveler. While walking across this planet, keep your eyes open for the 6 moons, each of whom shine in different shapes and sing in different octaves. There are many rivers on this planet, but only one sea. Sometimes the whales, tired of the taste of salt water, enter the rivers and imagine they are otters. When it rains on this planet, the bears believe it is their dancing that has made such an event possible. If a comet moves across the sky from east to west, the forest nymphs know it is time for the oldest of them to marry. The clouds are all edible here if you can reach them. And should you have any difficulty sleeping, a short prayer to one of the moons should do the trick. Which one in particular? It doesn't matter. They're all capable of magic, and they're all excellent listeners. So this is a poem that kind of came about as a result of Southern California traffic, which, you know I'm certainly not alone in being frustrated by it. So this is called Wool Gathering. Lately, I've begun counting sheep in the daytime. It's nice, especially on an afternoon like this one, bumper to bumper on a freeway that feels thousands of miles from any pasture. The sheep all seem to understand. They gather around me as I offer my recitations and listen with the patience of saints. Later, we move deeper into the hills together, and I let them lead. They know where the river is and how much farther before we arrive at the Temple of Stars. So speaking of the quarantine, I wound up kind of stumbling into adopting a small kitten early on in the quarantine, which I had not expected. A friend of mine one evening had gone down to throw her trash away in the dumpster, and she found 4 brand new born kittens that were in there. And so we all just kind of took one, and this was my first experience with a pet. So it's been a lot of fun. So this is called Kitten. When I first bring you home, you remind me of an Ewok, one of those magical creatures who live in the enchanted moon forest of Endor in Return of the Jedi. Whether I'm Luke Skywalker or Han Solo in this context, I'm not sure. But I do know it means that no amount of gray hair can change the fact that I'm still the same boy I was nearly 40 years ago, when I first traveled to a galaxy far, far away and never completely returned. So, we were just talking beforehand about how sometimes writing in the morning is one of the kind of most enjoyable things to do. It's like you still have some of your dreams from the night before circling around your head. And so this is a poem that came out of one of those early morning kind of writing sessions. So this is called Morning Refrain. Before sunrise, the warm boat of my bed sails out to sea. Before sunrise, my dark hair returns and does not say where it's been. Before sunrise, my soul, the magician, pulls a second moon from the black hat of the sky. Before sunrise, it isn't clear whether I am dreaming or not. Before sunrise, the sister that I never had stops in for a visit. Before sunrise, I wish that I had learned to surf. Before sunrise, the most recent poem I've written asks me for a puppy. Before sunrise, my grandfather phones from his grave at the Veterans Cemetery to tell me he is glad to be among friends. Before sunrise, the sister I never had asks if I'd like to hear a song that she has written. Before sunrise, the sister I never had begins to sing. Her voice sounds like the waves, like the trade winds, like the sister I knew I'd always someday have. Before sunrise, I find myself in deep water. Before sunrise, my soul says he has run out of tricks. Before sunrise, the one cloud in the sky resembles my childhood bedroom. Before sunrise, my sister suggests I accompany her on the next song. Before sunrise, it occurs to me that I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. Before sunrise, the northern star kneels in prayer. Before sunrise, I wonder what it would take to be a merman in my next life. Before sunrise, my sister says she always wanted to sing with me. Before sunrise, my sister tells me to keep singing. Before sunrise, my sister swears that I will certainly see her again. So I spent a summer 4 or 5 years ago living up in the mountains in New Mexico. And it was a really beautiful experience, especially for, I never lived outside of a big city. And so it was quite a wonderful experience. The town I was living in was called Taos, an old kind of mountain community I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And this is one of the first poems that I wrote after having moved there. It's called Taos. I've always loved the moon at 4 a.m., reading the Song of Songs on winter nights, wild strawberries, lazy dogs, Robert Redford's final home run in The Natural, when the stadium lights make fireworks and Redford runs the bases slowly, aware he will never do so again. My beloved salmon tacos, Edward Hopper's seascapes, my father's laugh, my mother singing Dolly Parton, the stretch of Pacific Coast Highway from Bolsa Chica to Golden Lantern, Anne Brigman's nude self-portraits, Los Angeles at dusk, Pittsburgh under a full moon, San Francisco in any weather, rotary phones, record players, sourdough toast with strawberry jam, country songs with a sense of humor, folk songs without one, evenings when there is nothing to do but daydream, and mornings when there is nothing to do but write poems. I teach a children's literature class every few years at the college where I teach, and it's a lot of fun for me because I wind up just getting to assign, books that I hadn't read since I was 8 years old, and sometimes it surprises me the books that the students wind up enjoying the most. And the last time I taught it a few years back, that book was The Wind in the Willows. The students just absolutely loved it, and we had just the greatest discussion about it afterwards. And so this is a poem that kind of came out of that particular classroom discussion. It's called On Teaching The Wind in the Willows. We speak of the beauty of rivers. We laugh at the wild man antics of Mr. Toad, for whom a fast car and an open road are proof that grace is more easily found at 117 miles an hour. We compare ourselves to the mole and exchange stories of what it is we would miss most about our homes were we ever forced to leave them for good. Someone says bagels with cream cheese. Another says late nights in the pool. A third says the voice of my mother singing in the kitchen. Walking home later on that night, I think of the stereo we owned when I was a boy and how Tom Petty used to slip through its speakers like an older brother returning from the larger world to tell me about everything he had witnessed on his travels. I'll just read two more. This was a poem that wound up getting written after a particularly kind of really rough, probably the roughest flight I've ever taken. I arrived in Boston, the turbulence had been really terrible. There was even a kind of funny moment where the pilot came over the loudspeakers and he's like, there's going to be a little bit of a delay. We should be getting into Boston in an hour if we make it. He didn't have the greatest bedside manner. So what was great though is at Logan Airport when you land, if you go straight ahead from the terminal I was at, there's a little non-denominational chapel. And large numbers of people really started to kind of find their way right into that. So this is called Our Lady of the Airways Chapel, Logan Airport. It's empty when I first arrive, except for one Muslim woman kneeling on a prayer rug performing salah, her purple scarf wrapped loosely around her hair. I sit in one of the back pews and say the Our Father before reading the first few pages of a book by Robert Lowell. the unofficial patron saint of the city I'm visiting for the very first time. I've only just landed and already I feel like I'm flying again, as prayer and poetry cast their dual spells, and I find the room has become a sky that has never known rain, and that the woman and I comprise a small constellation that shines out over the sea. So this is the last one I'll read. Thank you for having me here today and spending this time with me. It's meant a lot to me. This last poem is about, I've always loved playing pickup basketball, and one of my favorite things about it is just some of the stories that you hear from the guys that you're hanging out with in between games when you're waiting for the next games to start. And this is a poem that came out of one of those stories. It's called New Orleans. In between games, he begins to tell me about his childhood in New Orleans. The ghost of Louis Armstrong with the Ninth Ward's patron saint. The full moons like polished brass. The constellations like an infinity of horns, trumpets and clarinets. The rain that tasted like gumbo. The women in the French Quarter who could turn the word hello into a poem and goodbye into an ode. Whose eyes were elegies the singers lamented each night in the clubs. And the slow marches through the streets to commemorate a death. Coffins like the slow, bruised ballads of that baritone who lived in the apartment above him, who never stopped singing those songs that were at least 75 years old, passed hand to mouth by field hands and dock workers, inmates and immigrants, the low, deep chord of the storms that flooded the streets like something out of the Old Testament. A city full of Noahs and run-down Chevrolets, their radio decks playing Dr. John, Fats Domino, Buddy Bolden, Alan Toussaint, Jelly Roll Morton, and Lee Dorsey. And those old balconies where the sex workers would sway at twilight with their wide hips like bass drums, like clipper ships, their eyes turned out towards the lake, where rumor had it the men went diving each night and returned come morning with 100 new songs and an extra octave that could carry them all the way to St. James Parish. Thank you.
Thank you, Kareem. Yeah, I'd like to open up the floor to some questions, if you have any. I have a few in mind too, but would like to open it up first.
I was just going to comment, that last poem you wrote, you could read that about 20 times. It's so much fun.
Oh, I appreciate that.
What
Thank
a
you.
reading.
Oh, thank you. I
All of
appreciate
it.
that. Is it Anna?
Anne.
Anne, thank you, Anne. I appreciate
Yeah.
that.
The Wind in the Willows, I've never read.
You know, it's so funny. I one of the things that I love about teaching sometimes is that I either get to reread books I hadn't read since I was a kid or books that I'd never read. And Wind in the Willows was one I had remembered, like I think my mother read to me when I was like 5, but you know, didn't remember anything about, and so I put it on the syllabus in this children's lit class, and I thought maybe the book was going to be a little too old-fashioned or what have you, and the students just loved it. And so it is one of the really kind of fun things sometimes, is being able to either rediscover these old books or to kind of read them for the first time.
Well, I'm going to be thinking of you and your class when I read it. Thank you.
I'm glad. Thank you. Thank you. It's very kind of you.
Do you have any books that you've written? Are they here?
Yeah, I brought some books,
Okay.
for sure.
For sale?
For sure, yeah,
Oh, okay,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Let's see one.
We'll lay them out on the
I'll
back.
put them out, yeah.
Take all my stuff.
That's what I was wondering. Did you read those all from the same collection?
They're from the two kind of most recent ones. Yeah, and I did bring some of those, yeah.
I was going to say, yeah, you can place them on the back there, and then at the end, after we finish the open mic, then we can go up and buy some books. Yeah.
Do you still play pickup?
It was funny. I had to, I gave it up about 3 years ago and started playing beach volleyball instead. Because every one of the guys that I've gone to high school with and played basketball with, like everybody had blown out their Achilles or their knee but me. So I was starting to see the writing on the wall.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it was time to graduate into something a little bit softer on the legs. But I miss it.
Do you get stories from beach
Oh yeah, yeah.
Poems from Beach Volleyball.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so.
How
I
many
never hear
different
that, sorry.
books do you have? 3?
I think I brought 4 different ones.
4?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
What was the amusing name you gave to the chapel at the end of the airstrip?
Well, that's actually its name. So it's called Our Lady of the Airways Chapel. And my guess is it's kind of like a holdover from Boston's kind of very Catholic legacy, that like it's one of the few airports I can think of where you come out of a very specific terminal and it's just right there and it's beautifully kind of kept up.
And at what age did you start to write your ideas in that form?
I started writing poems, I think, in general about 26, 27, so 20 years ago. Yeah, so.
But you were making those observations before that age, correct?
Not really. Yeah, I mean, so some of these, some of these are from childhood memories, but I really kind of started thinking about, experiences I've had in terms of putting them into poems probably for about the last 20 years. Yeah.
How
Yeah.
old were you when you wrote your first poem?
Well, it's funny. I mean, so the first poems that I remember writing, I was in my mid-20s, 25, 26. But I was helping my mother move about 2 years ago, and I was going through her garage, and she's kept everything. And I did find a lot of like little poems from when I was even 6 or 7 that I have no kind of memory of. But so clearly it was always, I guess, kind of in the orbit for me. When my dad had come to this country, he had loved the city he was from in Iran. Shiraz is like a very kind of famous city of poetry. A lot of the ancient poets like Hafez and Sadi and stuff are from there. And so he had a lot of poems memorized. And so when I was a little kid, like before I would go to sleep, sometimes he would just kind of recite them to me. And so I definitely was kind of always really enjoyed that. And so I think even years before I started to actually write, that stuff was always in my head, I think, in a way. Yeah.
What was the title of your second one? Because I liked it and
The second
poem.
Was it the Mariachi Singer poem? I think it was Mariachi Singer. I think it's just called Mariachi Singer Olvera Street.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys ever have this problem too, but like you'll forget what you've written. So, I did a reading at a class about a week ago, and they were asking me like what I was thinking when I'd written a certain poem, and I was like, I think I just made something up. It's like I had no memory of it whatsoever.
Real quickly, do you find that you write poems and they don't have to work on them much and they kind of come out 90% the way they're finalized, or do you have to work on poems a lot?
So I know everybody kind of has a different method for this. I actually give myself a rule where I never go back and rework on a poem. So I have to sit down, start it, finish it, and edit it in one sitting. Because what I realized the first couple years I was writing poems, I over-edited, and I found up noticing that then kind of what I liked about the poem initially, I kind of just like ruined. And a friend of mine around that time who was a musician had this great line where he had said, he said, I've never heard an album that I felt was underproduced, but I've listened to a lot of albums that felt overproduced, where they were too busy. And so I never go back. Like if I go back later and see one that I didn't think kind of worked exactly well, I'll just write a new poem. I know that's different for everyone, but I definitely don't like to kind of go back and edit. Then it's just like you can get in this mindset where you're going to edit it to death in a sense, and I've certainly done that at times.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
You read, the room becomes a sky that has never known rain. And I just found your work so moving and beautiful and tender and deep and uplifting, and like uplifting without being sentimental.
Oh, I appreciate that.
So is that by intent?
Obviously I guess we can never control what, I'm really glad you responded that way. But it definitely is by intent in terms of, I remember when I was in grad school, one of the things that used to drive me crazy sometimes was that idea that a lot of times people had where poetry had to be suffering, that it could only be dark night of the soul kind of stuff. And I always thought that seemed, I mean, that's not true for any other art form, you know, that there can be happy songs and sad songs, you know, and so I definitely have at least made a conscious effort to try to kind of weave joy or happiness or a sense of celebration into a lot of my poems. Because also then I feel like then when you do write something that's sad or that's full of longing, I think it carries more weight, you know, because it's rare in a sense. So that's certainly something I strive for. I don't know, you know, sometimes I guess I'm more successful than others, but I'm glad you found that. Yeah. I mean, and I think also too, like I really enjoy writing poems, and I do want that to come through. You know, if you know, I'll hear sometimes people talk about how, like, what a miserable experience writing can be for them, and I'm always like, God, if it was that way for me, I wouldn't want to do it. You know, so you know, I do hope the kind of process of just enjoying what I'm doing comes through as well. So thank you for that.
I had a question.
Yeah.
You seem to take a lot of inspiration from pop culture and music, and a lot of your work is really situated in place. I was just wondering if you could speak to that and how, you know, I think sometimes it can be difficult to bleed other things in beyond the psychological. So I want to know a bit more about the process of what tends to be the spark to start writing, and how is it that you weave, you know, some of these more accessible things into your work.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think there's a couple things. One, you know, I'm an only child, and my parents both worked a lot. I was alone a lot, and so like the pop culture that was surrounding me, the music that I was listening to, or the films I was watching and rewatching, or the TV shows I was watching, became like a really significant part of my life in a lot of respects. You know, that, I mean, it's, especially when you're 8 or 9 or 10 years old, like they become a kind of surrogate family, you know, when you don't have kind of other voices around you. And so I think that stuff kind of naturally has found its way into my work, because in my formative years, that stuff was so important to me in some really foundational ways. The idea of also things being firmly rooted in place, I think there's a couple things with that. One, my you know, I mentioned my dad came here, he was 18 or 19 years old, and to him this was like a brand new world. I mean, he might as well have been landing on Mars. You know, he came here alone, he didn't know anyone, he couldn't speak the language. And my parents were very young when they had me. So when they had me, he was still pretty new to this country. And so he had a kind of very wide-eyed sense of everything that he was processing, and I think I picked up on a lot of that. And then the second thing is my grandfather's job for, you know, the 50 years of his career was he was a city surveyor for the city of Los Angeles, and I spent a lot of time with he and my grandfather, and he would take me on these long walks across the city and just kind of point everything out to me. And so I feel like having those two dual experiences, like I definitely became like a very intensive looker, you know, that I was always just kind of like hyper aware of everything, because I think the two kind of central men in my life, that's kind of how they process their surroundings in some very intensive ways. And so I even find a lot of times when I'm writing that, like, when I'm describing a sense of place, I am kind of seeing it through their eyes in a sense. And so I think that's why a lot of those details have kind of come about. I think, did I miss your hand back there? Yeah.
That's okay. Hi.
Hi.
I resonated with your comment about when you read your pieces, they kind of leave you, and I've had that experience too. And can you speak a little to that process?
Yeah. That's a really interesting experience, isn't it? I mean, it's part of the beauty of art is that, you know, you only have so much control over it, and we definitely have no control over how people receive it. And I think that can be a really freeing thing. That, like, you know, there's so many things in our lives that we have to control, and that we have to be kind of, you know, kind of always on top of. And I kind of love the idea of like something inspiring us and just kind of coming through us, and then you just kind of you allow that to happen, and then you let it become what it's going to be.
Yeah.
You know, there's that great, I think it's Billy Collins, that great Billy Collins poem about teaching his students poetry, and he's like, it's an introduction to poetry class, and he says, all my students want to tie the poem to a chair and beat it with a hose until it gives up its meaning. And he's like, that's not how it works, you know. And I think that's good advice, not just for reading, but for writing, right? Is to just kind of let whatever's going to happen come through you. I'm guessing you've had this experience too, right? Where the poem that you wind up writing is not the poem you thought you were going to write. And it's like you can either try and force it back into being what you wanted, or just kind of like, well, this is what it is. You know, it's funny. Even you know, you mentioned in my bio. I wrote a young adult novel 5 or 6 years back, and like that was not supposed to be a young adult novel. And then 40,000 words in, you realize, wow, this is a young adult novel. Like something else is spoken, and it's not really up to me at this point. You know?
What was it
So,
supposed to be?
it was. I thought I was writing this kind of really like high-level literary, you know, and then I kind of had this one. I'm like, well, that's not what this is, you know. I like it, but I'm going to have to kind of be okay with what it's become, you know.
Did the muse humble you?
Totally. Well, especially too when then you have, like, I had a friend of mine read it, kind of when it was a draft, and she's like, oh, it's a young adult novel, and I was like, yeah, I guess so. Like, you know, at that point, you know, you just kind of have to go with it. So.
That's great. One last question, anyone?
I just want to finish on that. The poem
Sure.
sits like almost like a triangle inside of me, and then when I read it out loud, it's gone.
I love that.
It's dissipated. It's transformed into something else. And I really resonated when you said you can't remember your poems, because that's the same feeling.
It's a beautiful feeling, especially too, because then what happens a lot of times, I mean, I've certainly had this happen where, like I remember a few years back, I was speaking to like a class of undergraduates who had read one of my books, and what they were observing about like certain recurrent themes in the book had never occurred to me. You know, because like you're almost too close to it that you don't know what you have, but then like hearing them talk about it and the way they received it made me feel closer to stuff that I had produced, you know, and so that is kind of one of the beautiful things about it, right, is that it is a real mutual, you know, a mutual experience of like, you create something and put it out there, and then people you know or don't know kind of give it back to you in some really lovely ways, you know, and so I really like that experience of it, so I wouldn't want to feel that I have this very intensive ownership over what I'm writing or need to control, because that seems to be kind of squandering what can wind up being a really lovely part of the experience, you know.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Kareem Tayyar, thank you.